We are all volunteers, and all the donations within this community will be recognized. I want you to know that occasionally we get donations from across the country, which is incredible. In the program book, there is a list of 23 years of impressive speakers who have given their time without honorariums to inform the community about the multiple issues of gun violence. The coalition's agenda is educating the community and helping to support sensible gun legislation. In California, the number of gun deaths has declined lower than the national average because, as you heard from Hannah Beth, California has enacted more and better gun violence prevention laws. At this point, I'd like to acknowledge some of the elected officials who are with us. Congressman Salud Carbajal hoped to be here, but he has a representative in his place. Senator Jackson was able to be here for only 30 minutes, but she gave an inspiring speech as always. And Assemblymember Monique Limon also has to return to Sacramento earlier than planned. With us are Santa Barbara County Supervisors Doss Williams and Janet Wolf. Was Joyce Dudley able to make it? I don't think so. And we have Santa Barbara Mayor Kathy Murillo and Goleta Mayor Paula Perot. And Carpinteria, where I hail from, is Mayor Fred Shaw. City Council members here are Eric Friedman and Jason Dominguez. And also here is my mentor from the Women Against Gun Violence, Ann Rice Lane. Where are you, Ann? She inspired me, as did this woman right here. If you see, Eileen Pritikin. Eileen and I organized this organization. I had the inspiration, she had the organizational skills. The California is proud to announce that in cooperation with the Santa Barbara Police Department, we are organizing our 4th annual Central Coast Gun Buyback on Saturday, May 12th at the Earl Warren Showgrounds in the parking lot. The coalition received $10,000 from the city of Santa Barbara, and the city of Carpinteria donated funds along with many of you and other supporters. It is amazing that this organization, this little group of dedicated people, has been able to pull together 4 gun buybacks. And never underestimate the power of a grassroots organization. However, going forward, we hope that all the cities and the county plan to put our tax dollars to work towards community safety by funding an annual gun buyback. And plans and information about the current event may be found in the back of your program book and also in a flyer that is on your chair. I have said this every year, but this year is different. We know that gun violence is a public health epidemic and requires each of us to take a stand. We know most of us in some way, large or small, need to do something about gun violence. But most of us say, yes, we agree, and then what? We are encouraging people. There are sign-up sheets all over the place. Even if you think you can't do something, you can. If you gave an hour a week, that would be sufficient. Why and how do we know that life is not normal? Right now we know that because young people in America are marching out and shouting out. And they're saying, and I quote from a film that you all will remember, "We are mad as hell and we're not going to take this anymore." That's right. We must listen and encourage these voices and pay attention to the youth who are leading us. Why? Because instead of doing geometry, history, and English, they are hiding, crowded in corners of their classrooms, wondering if bullets will mow them down. What lessons are they learning? Pay attention to what they are saying. We don't want teachers with guns. We don't want officers patrolling the grounds with guns. We don't want metal detectors turning schools into prisons. We want to be kids in school, learning and enjoying the precious years of childhood. There are 5 suggestions I would like to make. Our police chief, Lunau, agreed that each police station should have a hotline for kids to report see something, say something, which comes from the Homeland National Security. Then we might have fewer suicides as well as fewer homicides. Gun owners believe that a gun is in their home for protection, not if that gun is accessible. Kids can teach parents to ask. Asking is an acronym for Asking Saves Kids. There is a law in California that all firearms should be stored, unloaded, and locked with the ammunition separate. Are accidental deaths really accidents, or are they carelessness? 3, worried about mental health? Well, you're going to learn a lot today from our speaker about the Gun Violence Restraining Order, a law that can save not only kids, but emotionally disturbed individuals. Therapy isn't shameful, it's helpful. 4, we need a list of all elected officials across the country, both federally and in every state, by name, who receives funds and how much from the NRA. And we have to know exactly how much. And these people will be targeted by voters so that they are not voted back in. And be a patriotic citizen, vote. Kids in California can register at the age of 16 and vote at 18, and that law was enacted with the help of Senator Jackson. We thought things would change after Virginia Tech, after Aurora, and certainly after Sandy Hook. Now, after Parkland, kids are demanding changes in gun policies and Americans' gun culture. That is the only way our children won't be hiding in corners, learning fear instead of science. Several of our elected officials who plan to be with us today have given their regrets due to legislative business, which is certainly critical. Along with regrets, they made statements for their representatives to convey. Who is here for Congressman Salud Carbajal? Please.
Thank you, Tony, and good afternoon. My name is Wendy Mota, and Congressman Carbajal asked me to come here this afternoon to express his gratitude to all of you for your work to end gun violence, and importantly, to Tony Wellen for being at the helm of the Coalition Against Gun Violence. I remember fondly and proudly working with her and Eileen Pritikin when it first began in 1994 when I worked for Jack O'Connell. And both the congressman and myself appreciate her dedication and perseverance to this imperative cause. When my son started kindergarten in 1999, I could never have imagined that later that same year, something as shocking as what happened at Columbine High School could take place, and that he would spend his entire school career faced with gun violence drills at every school he attended. Fortunately, the coalition was already established and gave voice to community concerns. Looking back, there have been too many tragedies since its inception, like our own heartbreaking personal tragedy in Isla Vista. That is why Congressman Carbajal has made gun violence a top priority in Washington, D.C. One of his first pieces of legislation that he authored as a newly elected member of Congress was the Gun Violence Restraining Order Act, similar to Pause for Safety that Congresswoman Capps had previously authored. He has worked very hard to secure bipartisan support for this legislation and has over 100 co-sponsors who have signed on to it. The act would allow immediate family members or law enforcement officers to seek court orders to seize any firearms possessed by individuals suspected of posing a danger to themselves or others. This legislation is also a priority for the Parkland students, who Congressman Carbajal had the opportunity to sit down with shortly after the incident at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School, and then again last March. These young people standing up for what is right is an inspiration to us all. And as we all sadly know, one tweet or national distraction can take the public's focus from this critical work. I ask you all this afternoon to continue to put pressure on Washington, D.C. to make sure this legislation and other crucial gun violence measures become law. The most important thing you can do is to continue to work with this coalition, which coordinates with national organizations to advocate for support of gun violence measures in other congressional districts. You can also ask your friends and family who live in other areas of the country to reach out to their congressional representatives and make their voices heard. We have a great opportunity with the energy and drive of these young people, and we must stand with them to end gun violence in our schools and our nation. Thank you.
I want to let you know that on the table where the projector is, there are some cards and pencils, and if during any part of the presentation you have a question that you want to ask, and you need to hold that thought for a little while, it would be good to write it down. So you can come up and get a little 3x5 card and a pencil. Our Assembly member Monique Limon has someone here who is representing her and has a few remarks to make.
Thank you. My name is Johnny Garcia Vasquez. It is an honor to be here today on behalf of Assemblymember Monique Limon. On behalf of Assemblymember Limon, I would like to read the following statement. I want to thank Toni Wellen for her commitment to our safety and the work of the Coalition Against Gun Violence to reduce the number of firearms present in our county. We have seen one too many tragedies nationwide and incidents that reach our own neighborhoods every day. We know changes need to be made at many levels, from our homes to the policies set at the state and federal levels. The California legislature is working towards this effort as we see legislation moving through this year. But as the process takes its course, the impact of your work locally can be seen every year as more and more weapons are removed from the streets, especially with the annual gun buyback. Thank you, CAGV, for your continued advocacy, for not giving up and losing hope. I stand with you and the many students who are speaking louder to protect their peers and our families from gun violence. Thank you very much.
Some of you have heard of this young woman. Her name is Izzy Huerta. She is a junior at San Marcos High School and is in the Entrepreneurship Academy and currently ASB President-elect. Izzy is also a community activist and is involved as a board member of Just Communities, one of our partner organizations. Izzy is most proud of her Latinx identity and organizes on behalf of marginalized and disenfranchised youth to bring about change where it is most needed. Izzy?
Good afternoon, I'm Izzy. I want to say thank you to Tony Wellen of the Santa Barbara Coalition Against Gun Violence for inviting me to share a few words with such an honorable group of individuals. Since learning about the coalition, I appreciate the critical work you have done for over 20 years to bring about gun reform and change in our community. The attack at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, was the latest in what seems like an inescapable pattern of mass shootings, followed by thoughts and prayers, public mourning, and funerals, until the next tragedy. It was at this moment that our youth were emboldened on the front lines to demand change and to demand safety. For those who doubt youth-led movements, you only need to look to the East LA walkouts or Chicano blowouts of 1968 to see that youth of color are not afraid, void of a voice, or ignorant about their rights. Our youth aren't tired, they are sick. They are sick of the lack of regard and respect for those of us who are victims of violence in schools, but yet cannot vote. It is apparent that the youth of this nation must never be underestimated, that the change we seek is not just for our future generations, but a change we wish to see in our future. To those who turn away from our supplications, we remind you that we are watching, we are taking notes, and we are headed to the polls very soon. No matter your political affiliations, we are watching. Now, what are we asking for? We are asking for more than gun reform and school safety protocols in our nation. We are asking that you work toward helping our school communities tackle some sensitive and extremely critical issues. For this, I would like to outline two key focus areas. First, implicit bias is an issue that is not discussed with seriousness in our school environment. The implicit bias held by our peers and the adults in charge of our education materialize into hurtful bullying, microaggressions, and inequity in our schools. We ask that these issues not only be discussed with courage by our politicians, but that laws are created that would help mitigate the implicit bias. The implicit bias, I apologize. We ask that these issues not only be discussed with courage by our politicians, but that laws are created to mitigate the implicit bias that many hold towards youth of color. Even today, you can help by supporting AB 2772, which would require an ethnic studies course to be compulsory for graduation. AB 2772 has undeniable benefits, especially for at-promise youth. Second, our nation must engage in a serious discussion about how we can improve mental health support for our children and youth, not just to prevent horrific acts of violence, but to also support their well-being, academic achievement, and success in life. Schools play a central role in keeping students safe and supporting their mental health. In circumstances like the Florida tragedy, we need to not only develop proactive strategies for intervention and cultivation of our mental health, but also create school environments where all youth feel comfortable and safe accessing mental health services. Now, these are only a few of the many solutions that we wish to see implemented in our communities and in our nation. I call upon all of you, our experts, leaders, and great minds to listen to our requests and bring it to action. Thank you.
Thank you, Izzy. We are impressed, aren't we? This is the sort of thing that young people are doing across the nation, and that is what we need to follow. We need to listen and follow and encourage these brilliant young minds to be our leaders. We will follow you. Gloria de Jesus Heck from Portland, Florida, is here with us today. Her son, Cisco, is a student at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. He could not come because the students have organized this weekend a special prom in honor of the students who died there. Gloria is a real estate investor, realtor in Florida and California, and a multimedia advertising specialist. Gloria was raised in Southern California, and she studied at UCSB, where she was a radio host on KCSB, so she's like a native here. She studied in Spain and has been guest lecturer at the Florida International University in Miami as an expert on the topic of online advertising. Gloria is involved in real estate in both Florida and California. She lives in Parkland, Florida with her husband and 2 children. And Gloria spent yesterday with Santa Barbara's Youth Council at an all-day long meeting. Gloria.
Hello, I'm honored to be here today, and I wanted to give you an idea of what it felt like to be the parent of a child who was involved in this situation. So it was February 14th this year. It was a beautiful sunny day. It was the day we celebrate love. It's also the day like no other. It will forever stain our memories. The plan was to shop in the early afternoon for some ingredients to make a wonderful dinner for my husband, my daughter Francesca, and my son Cisco. When Cisco was going to come home, we were going to go to the health food store and get him some vitamins. And then I was going to finish our dinner. At 2:40 p.m., a text came in from a friend who lived outside of the country. "Is your son okay?" she asked. I thought, how strange. School will be ending soon, so I have to hurry up and finish my grocery shopping. I text her back, "Why?" She says, "There's a shooting at his school." Immediately, I call Cisco. He answers the phone in a whisper. "Are you okay?" "Mommy, we are hiding." The phone line drops. I see in the news there's a mass shooting at a school. It dawns on me that my baby's life is in jeopardy. I break down in tears. A woman asks me what's wrong. I tell her there's a shooting at my son's school. She begins to pray for the safety of the children. I am calmed enough to leave the store. In utter terror, I drive home, watch the news, and prep for our special dinner. My hands shake as I cook. I'm in slow motion. The minutes and then hours creep. Cisco's not answering his phone. I pray. I hope. I bargain. Please let him be safe. People call, text. I have no answers. It shows on TV the kids are being released from the school. His best friend's mother tells me her son is at home, but still no Cisco. I keep cooking, as if my life and my loved ones' lives depend on it. Shaking, anguish, trying to finish my task. In my core, I know he's okay, that our dinner needs to be ready for when we all sit down to eat and talk about our day. 5:15, or is it 5:30? Time escapes me. The door opens. It is my son. I am thankful, happy to see him. We hug. His body is drenching wet. He is one of the lucky ones, a survivor. I'm honored to be here today. As a student at UCSB, I never would imagine that I would be here representing my community, Parkland, Florida. And it's unfortunate that my little town of Parkland is so well known, infamous, because of what happened at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the mass shooting by one troubled soul. The grief that we all feel for the loss of our 17 fallen angels will haunt us for the rest of our lives. My son Cisco and his fellow MSD students are forever changed. The outrage of emotion has created the Never Again movement, led by students who have transformed their grief into a call to action. From the mouth of babes who call BS and demand change, we, the adults, are inspired by these student leaders who selflessly give of themselves to fight for gun control, and these efforts are not in vain. Already laws are changing, but there's still so much more that needs to be done. 3 weeks ago, we informally hosted MSD students at our home. We spoke to media and gun control advocates about the next wave of leaders and the need for more. I truly believe that our nation's youth will guide us out of the darkness. For those who think that the teens are liberal pawns, I say, you must not be a parent. We've raised our kids to think for themselves, to ask why, and question authority, even if it challenges us as parents. The tipping point is upon us, and we cannot stop until our laws are changed so that shooting in schools, theaters, churches, festivals, or any public places is a sad part of our past, because no one, especially a high school student, should have to walk out of a school to pass dead bodies or plan their week based upon the funeral schedule of their murdered classmates and teachers. We must be relentless in supporting sensible gun law in an effort to prevent this from ever happening again. Thank you.
Thank you, Gloria, for bringing us into that moment in your life that was so terrifying but turned out for you to be a blessing. I would like to, before we continue with the bell ceremony, I would like to thank Melissa Compton and Greg Compton for doing so much work in the electronics and setup here, and all the volunteers of the Coalition Against Gun Violence, and people who are not yet volunteers, but are not yet members, but came to volunteer. Laura Lynch has done the program book and the website and the signage and all the graphic arts for 23 years. And of course, I really enjoyed, and I hope you did too, the San Marcos Jazz Band, led by music director Michael Keogh. Terry Jory has been the photographer today, and Mark Brinkley is the videographer right back there. Here are some final words from me, Tony Wellen, and as always in my heart, I keep Eileen with me. This photograph and article that was in the news press in 1995 sits in my office every day. We are moving into a new era. As Eileen stepped aside for me, it is now time for me to step aside. You know the usual statement, to spend time with family. Well, that, in my case, is true. Unfortunately, my husband is not feeling well today. I drag him everywhere, but he was unable to come with us, to be with us today. Several well-known people in the community are searching for a co-chair who I will work with until the end of the year. However, I'm not going to slip silently into the night. You know I'm never silent. I will continue to work on legislation and on our TVSB show with Jackie Inda, my co-host, who inspired the TV show. And we will continue with the e-news to all those people on our e-list. And if you're not, please put your name down and get the e-news from us. I will continue to speak for gun violence prevention when asked. We are now going to proceed to the bell ceremony. And I want to introduce, in case you don't know them already.
You know what, the keynote speaker first.
Yeah. Thank you, Doss. I want to say something. I got out of sync. We are going to have our presentation before we have the bell ceremony, duh. And I want to, I don't have to introduce Doss Williams to you, first county, first district. But I want to tell you something. I was evacuated for 10 days after the fire. I live up on Shepherd Mesa in Carpinteria. And when we were allowed back, Doss was standing in the road just before you go up the hill to the mesa. And he hugged every person as they drove up the road. That was really special. Thank you for keeping me on track.
So I have a brief statement, and then I get the honor of introducing our keynote speaker. I know this can be a dark subject, and sometimes a sad and a subject of unbelievable tragedy. But I want to give you some reasons to be a little optimistic. I mean, number one, if you've been watching TV, or if you watch these youth in action, you can't help but be inspired, right? Am I right? And I just, some of you have already probably been assigned this, but if you're ever assigned Les Miserables, one of my favorite stories, don't let them give you the abridged version. Because the abridged version's all a love story and a story of redemption. But they cut out 2/3 of the pages. And what are the other 2/3 of the pages? A story about revolution and faith and poverty. And they got it right. You got it right. I can tell you, because I had the honor of doing politics outside of the United States before, in the middle of a revolution in South Africa. And I don't care whether you're talking about on the streets of Tunisia in the pro-democracy protests, or you're talking about Tiananmen Square with students standing up tanks, or in South Africa, or in Florida, in the United States. It is the activism, it is the energies, it is the enthusiasm, and unfortunately sometimes the blood of the youth that fuels revolutions. And there is a revolution happening out there, so you guys deserve an extra round of applause for that. I think the other reason is, we have seen this community become a center of a great progress in the gun violence restraining order. It's only been adopted by a couple states, but we were one of the first. And we were one of the first because tragedy struck us. But we took action. And now after that legislation of mine and Nancy Skinner's passed, we now have it in the state, and Santa Barbara County is the county that has utilized that tool more than any other. And that means that people know about it here, and hopefully we can spread the message to other parts of California where they can avail themselves of it, but they don't yet know that they can. And now to other states. Right? This is one of the big debates going on in other states, and obviously thanks to Salud in the nation. But we got a good shot in some of these states of seeing gun violence restraining orders legislation. And then, I would be remiss, as someone who used to be a young man of color, to not talk about the other big problem. Most gun violence deaths don't happen from high-profile shootings. Most gun violence deaths happen from the everyday violence on the streets of America's cities. And I want to tell you that that's not far away from us. One of those cities where that is happening all the time, and for $100 you could find any weapon you want, is in Santa Maria, in our own county. That so much of that takes place because of straw buying. Unethical people that legally can purchase guns and then reselling them to people who cannot legally purchase guns. And we do have some restrictions in this state, but there are very few restrictions in other parts of the country. We've got to keep that message on straw buying going strong. With that, I want to tell you I'm really excited to introduce our keynote speaker today, Amy Barnhorst. Am I pronouncing that right? Dr. Barnhorst. It was one of our witnesses when we attempted to pass the gun violence restraining order in the state. She is one of the many people whose hearts have been touched by these tragedies. She was inspired, convicted. I use that word. Her heart was convicted after Sandy Hook. But she's a real professional. She's got more expertise than some of us that have gotten into this. She is the vice chair for a 50-bed inpatient psychiatric a crisis unit in a 50-bed patient psychiatric hospital. You're going to have to tell me someday how you got 50 beds, because the legal limit is 26, I think, from 16. So you're going to have to tell me that, because if we got that, we could solve a lot of problems here in Santa Barbara. She is going to talk about a very important subject, because one of the questions I get this from people of both political persuasions, but of course it's become, unfortunately, a talking point of sort of the right-wing excuse for why we shouldn't do gun legislation, which is, well, if we could just identify all these people with X's on their foreheads that are about to do a mass shooting, then we'll be able to solve everything, right? I mean, you've heard it on the talk shows. The mental health system is broken. We need to fix that, not pass gun violence legislation. It is a question that many people ask, but it has become a talking point of the right. And Dr. Barnhorst is here to give us a little bit of critical thinking about that claim. So I'm really excited to hear you. Come on up, Dr. Barnhorst. Welcome to Santa Barbara. We really appreciate it.
To get some technological stuff arranged here, but I want to thank Tony for arranging all this and inviting me down, and thanks everyone for coming. And I also want to thank my brother Zach and Greg, who overcame great technological adversity to get my slides up for you. We'll see if this stays. Are they up now? Yeah. Any slides you do get to see is thanks to them. So. Okay, I think I'm mobile. I'm gonna have to give my slide person the thumbs up, so if I keep going like this, it's not my own self-promotion, I'm telling him to change my slides. So I'm Amy Barnhorst, I'm a psychiatrist in Sacramento, and as Das said, I run an inpatient unit and crisis unit, and I do a lot of violence risk assessments. And prior to Sandy Hook happening, I really had no involvement in the gun violence world at all, and I was blissfully ignorant about it all. But I also, when Sandy Hook happened, I had 2 daughters in elementary school. And like so many parents, I was terrified and I felt really powerless and I was scared to send my kids to school every day. And it really changed the way I felt about bringing them to this very, very safe place I had thought previously while I went to work all day. But my other job as a psychiatrist, I found myself getting really irritated because everybody was saying, well, it's the mental health system. It's a big mental health problem. The mental health system should have found this guy, treated him, stopped him. And I'm the person on the front of that mental health system. I am the first person to do those evaluations of people who were brought in involuntarily for dangerousness, and then also the person who has to treat them and fix this. And so I found myself really struggling with that. But nonetheless, we continue to see every time there is a mass shooting, people bringing attention in the media to these shooters and their presumed mental illness. And we see it all over the place, that's the first thing everybody points to. I think there's one more. And then the politicians jump in and say, we should focus on mental health care, not on new gun laws. This is a very convenient narrative because it really takes the focus away from having to pass controversial firearm legislation. And everybody can support getting behind a better mental health system. I mean, I feel sort of like a traitor saying that that's not really the solution. And in fact, this is reflected in public opinion. So this is a poll from the Washington Post where they asked people, do you think mass shootings are a sign of mental health problems or gun law failures? And 63% of Americans said mental health problems. It is easy to understand why that is. I mean, I can't stand here in front of you and argue that somebody who would go shoot up an elementary school or a high school and kill a bunch of innocent children is some paragon of mental stability or psychological well-being. But that's different than being mentally ill, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. So the questions I'll talk about today are, can we rely on the mental health system to identify these people, to treat them and get them better and maybe prevent them, and also to be a mechanism to prohibit them from obtaining firearms? So we'll start with the first one. Are people with mental illness at an increased risk of violence? Well, when we think about firearm violence, a lot of us in this room, what we worry about are those mass shootings. But if you look at the CDC data from 2015 firearm homicides in the United States, public mass shootings are that tiny green sliver at the top of the slide. And all of that red, that is that steady daily trickle, hourly trickle of firearm deaths going on in this country in the context of criminal activity, domestic disputes, gang violence. And we kind of tell ourselves like, this is not stuff that applies to us. We worry about that green sliver because we're all in schools and theaters and malls and churches. But really, and Doss alluded to this earlier, there is a whole body of firearm deaths going on that we don't see as much of on the news. And we don't assume that those are all perpetrated by people with mental illness. So are people with mental illness at an increased risk of violence? Well, the answer is not really. They're actually vulnerable populations. So they're much more likely to be the victims of a violent crime than be perpetrators of violent crime. So when I see my folks who are pretty severely mentally ill, I don't worry about them hurting me. I worry about them getting hurt out on the street. But there are some certain circumstances where this does not hold. And one of those is in the beginning of a psychotic illness. So a psychotic illness is something like schizophrenia, where you start to lose touch with reality, maybe operate under a delusional system of beliefs where you think things are so that are not actually true, or even suffer from auditory hallucinations that tell you to do things that you really don't want to do, but they're so relentless and so persistent that people often do act on them. Also, the period surrounding psychiatric hospitalization, there is a slightly increased risk during that time of people being violent. Well, how much more? Like how much of a risk is it? And when we talk about increased risk like this, we talk about something called odds ratios. And if you have a serious mental disorder, and this is not like you have a little social phobia or a specific phobia of snakes, or maybe you have some insomnia. I'm talking about really serious disorders where you might have landed in a hospital, you miss work days, you're not able to carry out your normal day-to-day functioning when you're ill. Your odds ratio of committing an act of violence is about 2.44 above that of the regular population. So what that means is you're a little more than twice as likely to commit violence than somebody who doesn't have a serious mental disorder. That's not minimal, but in the world of odds ratios, it's actually not that big. So let's compare it to substance abuse. We all know drugs are bad, but we may not have all realized how bad they are for violence. So when we look at the odds ratios for violence, the increased risk of violence when you have a substance abuse problem and no mental illness at all is almost 7-fold. That means people with substance abuse issues are about 7 times more likely to commit violence than people without. If you have both a substance abuse problem and a serious mental illness, which I will admit many of my patients do, those things are often comorbid, unfortunately, you have about a 10-fold higher risk of committing an act of violence than somebody without either. But that being said, how much is this contributing to overall violence in the community? Now, this is a slide I borrowed from Jeff Swanson, who you'll hear a little bit more about his data later. He does a lot of research on violence and mental illness that's really helpful to inform good policy and good practice. And this is actually not firearm violence particularly, this is just community violence. So this whole piece of the pie, or the whole pie, represents all the violence going on out there in the community. That little yellow slice on top, that is the amount of violence in the community that is due only to mental illness. All that other stuff, all the blue parts of the pie, that is violence that is due to other risk factors like substance use, impulse control problems, anger and outrage. So if we were to bolster up the mental health system to where it was just perfect, we caught everybody up who needed mental health services, we gave them the most awesome therapy and medications, and we fixed them up to 100% so that they contributed 0 to community violence, we would reduce community violence by a whopping 4%. Again, I'm not saying we shouldn't bolster the mental health system, but maybe not for that reason. So the other part of firearm fatalities that's often unspoken is that we worry about violence and we really worry about that little green sliver, which now has all but disappeared on the top of this slide. 2/3 of the firearm deaths in the United States are actually suicides. And we don't hear nearly as much about those as we do the homicides. Part of the reason it's important is that firearm suicides are, they're over 90% fatal. You don't really get a second chance. Whereas if people choose overdose as their method, overdoses are less than 20% fatal. So firearms are a very, very lethal way to commit suicide. And in fact, if you look at all the suicides in the United States, over half of them, or about half of them, depending on the year, are committed by firearm. So when we do talk about the mental health system, another thing to consider is whether or not the mental health system can be a mechanism for getting guns out of people's hands. So you can't just take somebody's guns away if they own them legally or prevent them from buying more without certain conditions being met. And we'll talk a little bit about what those are. I'm sure you are all familiar with the Second Amendment to the Constitution, which gives people the right to keep and bear arms, and that shall not be infringed. This right went essentially unrestricted and unexamined for almost 200 years until the assassination of John F. Kennedy by a guy named Lee Harvey Oswald, who essentially ordered the rifle that he used to kill the president to his P.O. box with no background check, nothing. It was like Amazon Prime, right to his P.O. box, and he killed a president. So people thought, well, maybe we shouldn't make it quite this easy for people to get guns. The Gun Control Act is this big piece of federal legislation that regulates the firearm industry and their owners. And this is where we get that list of prohibited persons. So people who are not allowed to own firearms include felons, people who are addicted to a controlled substance, people who are respondents to domestic violence restraining orders, and most importantly for people in the mental health business, anyone who's been adjudicated as a mental defective, not my favorite term, but that's what's in there. And that generally means you've been found incompetent to stand trial or not guilty by reason of insanity, so it's part of the criminal justice system. Or anybody who's been committed to a mental institution. So committed to a mental institution does not mean what many people think. It does not mean anyone who has a DSM diagnosis. So again, if you have phobia of snakes, caffeine intoxication, sleep-wake disorder, all of those things in the Diagnostic and Statistics Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, you don't get put on some registry just for having a diagnosis. You don't get put on some registry just because you sought treatment from a mental health professional. So whether it was a counselor you saw in high school after a difficult time, or whether it was a psychiatrist you saw for a serious mental illness, that doesn't prohibit you from owning a firearm. Even people who've been put on a 5150 hold. Does everyone here know what a 5150 hold is? So 5150 is California's emergency 72-hour psychiatric hold. Most states have them. That's just what ours is called because of the statute. And it allows police or mental health employees to detain a person for evaluation for 72 hours on a 5150 hold if they are dangerous to themselves or others or they can't meet their basic needs. I would say that probably 80 to 90% of the professionals that I work with believe that if you've been on a 5150 hold, you're prohibited from owning firearms, and it's actually not the case. And also people who have a serious mental illness. So you can be very, very ill. You can be really, really in the throes of delusions or auditory hallucinations, but you're not going to be prohibited from owning firearms unless something has happened in the system that can actually be registered as meeting the prohibitory criteria. So committed to a mental institution, what it does mean is that after you've been involuntarily hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital, you get a chance to go before a hearing officer or a judge and argue your case. And only at that time, when the judge certifies your commitment, do you actually meet criteria for a federal prohibition. Depending on the process, the county, the holiday, and court schedules, this can be 10 to 12 days into your treatment. So people can be pretty ill and getting a lot of treatment over and over and over again and never actually meet federal prohibition criteria. In California, we do have a couple state-level prohibitions that are like a lower threshold that just prohibit you within the state. So any admission to a psychiatric hospital for dangerousness, it's not important if you haven't heard of TerraSoft, but for those of you mental health professionals out there, if you are subject to a TerraSoft warning, or if you're committed to involuntary outpatient treatment. But part of this is that if you are going to be a prohibited person, in order for that to mean anything, your records have to be reported to the federal background check system. And sellers of firearms have to actually check that system to see if your name is in it. So there's actually, the whole issue about people not having to do background checks at private party sales is another problem. But there's a big problem with states actually reporting the information to the NICS, or the Federal Prohibition Database. So these states have to go through all of their records from psychiatric hospitals, from the civil court system, from the criminal justice system. They have to deaggregate which of those records actually qualify for a federal prohibition, and then they have to upload them to the NICS database. So you can imagine the states were like, yeah, we'll get right on that. This is the 90s. You know, think about where people had these records. So there are a ton of names missing from the federal background check system. Even if people were really diligent about checking it before selling firearms, there's a good chance somebody who should be prohibited is not even in there. Okay, so we're not going to be great at prohibiting dangerous people through the mental health system. And we're not even sure that all dangerous people are necessarily going to be in the mental health system in the first place. But what about mass shooters? So I'm going to give you a couple examples of some people who perpetrated mass shootings who probably were mentally ill, but still sort of skimmed the surface of the system and were able to get their guns quasi-legally. This is a woman who, in the 90s in Utah, she had a history of psychiatric hospitalization. She had schizophrenia. She had been arrested and hospitalized for stalking an FBI agent that she believed was taking pictures of her in the nude and posting them or sending them to news agencies. And she went into a gun store and filled out the background check information. And at the time in Utah, the background check was asking people, "Are you allowed to buy a gun?" She said, "Well, yes, I am," which was not true. She had been involuntarily committed and arrested. So they sold her a gun. She essentially walked down the block, went into a TV station where she believed they were broadcasting videos of her intercourse all over the news, and she shot up a bunch of people in the TV station. So this is an example of somebody who was operating under this very delusional system. The mental health system of hospitalizing people, it doesn't exist so that we can get dangerous people off the street. It exists so that we can help sick patients who can't otherwise access the care they need. So in that moment, everyone blames this poor woman for not hospitalizing this guy or doing something. But in that moment, her thought, as it is with 99.9% of our patients, is, does this young man need hospitalization to help him? And what she decided was no. Hospitalization was not going to be of help to him, and so she decided not to put him on a hold. But school shooters are different. Those are three examples of people who very likely, again, I was never their psychiatrist, never examined them, but very likely had mental illness. And had it been treated, it might have prevented the mass shootings, but it didn't get treated beforehand. Most of the people who've perpetrated school shootings have a much more emotional relationship with the place that they go. And they have these really specific traits in common, a lot of narcissism and entitlement about what they deserve. And they're very grandiose, thinking that they should be more popular, getting more girls, having more fame than what they actually have. They have a long history of rage and grudge holding. And often they've been bullied and very socially isolated at their schools. And they have this elaborate revenge fantasy and this idea that they're going to get payback their way against all these other people. This is a model that is from two forensic psychiatrists that they call the pseudo-commando model. And it's partly called that because we see these guys go into the places where they shoot, their schools usually, but sometimes workplace shootings, decked out head to toe in camo gear, flak jackets. They have all these military-style weapons and way more than they could ever actually use. But it gives them this delusion that they're very, very powerful people. And oftentimes they end their rampages by either killing themselves or by having the police kill them somewhat deliberately so they can go out in this sort of grandiose blaze of glory to finally get the attention that they deserve. Oftentimes they have made comments about their peers being inferior to them and immoral. There's a history of stalking women in multiple cases where they really thought they were entitled to these women's sexual advances, sexual favors or whatever it was, and when they wouldn't receive them, they would then stalk them. Also, aside from misogyny, racism is another common theme where they find people of other races to be morally inferior. And more than one has had a diagnosis of autism, which is not universal, and people with autism are not inherently violent, but it speaks to that social disconnect. So one of the big features of autism is impaired peer social relationships. These are kids who just weren't able to connect with their peers, and that may have led to their feeling socially isolated and being on the fringe. And I think it also contributes to their ability to not see those peers as humans and to not value their lives as much as other kids would. And importantly, and this is a picture that I know is probably really evocative for lots of people here, these guys leave behind a very public message. And in the 90s with Columbine, it was a written manifesto. With the Virginia Tech shooting, it was a VHS tape. Here it was a YouTube video, so it's gotten more technologically advanced. But they want everybody to know why they did this. And their real message is, to their victims, you all drove me to this. You caused this. This is your fault. And most of the time, these guys, have seen a psychiatrist or a counselor for behavioral problems, maybe been prescribed medications for depression or ADHD, stuff that applies to millions of children across the nation who never do things like this. But very few of them had serious psychiatric diagnoses like schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Very few of them had something that would have actually prevented them from knowing that what they did was wrong, or not knowing what they were doing in the first place. They knew what they were doing, and they did it very intentionally. So it's really difficult as a psychiatrist when I see these folks, and I have actually evaluated a few, to want to bring them into, yes, we do have 50 beds in our psychiatric hospital, but I tell you, it's still not enough. We're very limited in our resources for our people with serious mental illness. And so bringing in everybody out there who's dangerous, if we can't treat them and get them better, is not a good strategy for what the mental health system is really designed to do. We're designed to get our people better from their mental illness and get them back to their homes, not to get every dangerous person off the streets. Okay, so how do we best target risky people? This is where the gun violence restraining order has been a really incredible piece of legislation. And I was lucky enough to help work on crafting it and then to testify for it. And I will say, seeing it put into use and seeing how it's being considered in all these other states after Parkland, even the federal government is looking at it, I sort of feel like, wow, I finally did something meaningful with my life. I'm really excited that this is out there. Thank you. And everyone here who's worked on it also, you should really feel like this is making a difference and this is saving lives. For those of you who are not as familiar with it, this is a law that allows family members or police to petition to have somebody's guns removed on the basis that they believe they are dangerous. It's a civil order, and it's modeled closely after the domestic violence restraining order, and I think that's why it's actually been so palatable for folks, because police can go in and get the person's guns very quickly with no chance for that person to make any argument. But like a domestic violence restraining order, due process is in place, and that person gets a chance to go to court in a few weeks and argue their side of the case, and if they win, they get their firearms back. If they don't, and the judge decides that they are in fact dangerous and the standard of proof is met, they can keep the guns away from them for up to a year. And my favorite part is no mental health evaluation or history is required. So no more do we even need to have the debate. Is this person mentally ill? Are they just a bad person? What exactly is their diagnosis? Who cares? The gun violence restraining order only cares that somebody thinks they are dangerous. And that is where it is most used. And it's interesting because I think, I testified for the bill here in California, and a few weeks ago now, I testified by phone in Alaska because they were considering it. And we went through the whole spiel about how important this is and how it closes these gaps between the mental health system and law enforcement, and how no mental health history is required because we don't even know if a lot of these people have mental illness. When we got through it all, two folks from the panel raised their hands and said, well, when's the mental health evaluation take part? Like, what part of this involves mental health treatment? And it was interesting because I know that cognitively they heard us say this, but people's association between violence and mental illness is so strong that they just kind of can't move past it. In other states who have had this, so in Indiana and Connecticut, they had something similar for many years. They call it risk warrant laws. But in those two states, family members can apply, just law enforcement. We passed our GVRO in 2014, and it went into effect 2 years ago. And since then, Washington and Oregon have passed a very similar law. They call it extreme risk protection orders. Florida just passed a law in the wake of the Parkland shooting. Vermont, who probably has 2 other laws on their books at all, also passed a law. And many, many other states are looking at it because it shows a lot of promise. Even the NRA released a video supporting this kind of legislation because it really goes with the narrative that it's people who kill people, and this is only targeting dangerous people. It's not some sort of sweeping gun grab. It's really targeting specific people. Jeff Swanson, again, who does a lot of the research on mental illness and violence, he's looked at a lot of this data that came out of the Connecticut risk warrant law and to see what sort of effect it's had, because it's been around for much longer than our laws. And he found that in 14 years, they had filed 762 risk warrants in the state, and that after the Virginia Tech shooting, the frequency went way up. They recovered firearms in 99% of the cases, so that's good to know. These were all people who had the means to do something. And that on average, they removed 7 guns per person. So these are not people who just had like one gun somewhere in their nightstand. And most importantly, I won't go through the math of this, but if somebody wants to talk to me about it later, I can explain it. Based on prevalence of suicide attempts, they estimated that for every 10 to 20 guns removed, which is really only 3 gun violence restraining orders filed, they saved 1 life from suicide. So that's a pretty good effect, if you ask me. We know here in California, we don't have enough data on the records to do any complicated quantitative analysis. But we do know from its use here in Santa Barbara and also in San Diego County that this law has already been used to prevent terrorist attacks, workplace shootings, domestic violence incidents, school shootings, and suicides. So we have stories about all these things being thwarted because somebody filed a gun violence restraining order. And I think that really speaks to the power of it, because that thing that we're so worried about, that little green sliver, this is actually a way that we can target those people without having to really broaden the criteria for prohibition through the mental health system. It may not do a lot for those firearm homicides that are happening in the context of daily crime and domestic disputes, but firearm suicides, those folks often have warning signs as well, and they often are legally able to own and buy guns. And that, again, is 2/3 of our firearm fatalities in this country. In Indiana and Connecticut, where we have enough data to know, both of those laws were passed in the wakes of violent events, but since their implementation, they have been used overwhelmingly for suicide prevention more than violence prevention. So, in conclusion, I'm just going to say I think this is a really wonderful piece of legislation and has the potential to make a big difference in saving lives, and thanks everyone here who has helped contribute to it. And I'm happy to take questions now or later, or is it okay, Tony, is it okay to do questions now, Tony? Okay, yeah.
Real quick, just what about medical practitioners reporting? I mean, it's family and police officers. If I, as a physician, say, you're crazy and I'm concerned you're going to, whatever, can I do it and protect myself?
So that's a great question, and one that comes up a lot. Tony and I were actually talking about this earlier, because when we originally started to craft the law, we talked about having practitioners on there. And then we said, well, okay, is it going to be doctors? Because does a dermatologist or urologist need to do this? Or is it going to be mental health practitioners? So psychiatrists, family practice docs, because they do a lot of mental health, marriage and family therapists, social workers. And what got really, so that got a little tricky. And then what got really tricky was the thought about, okay, is this going to be a HIPAA violation? Well, one easy way around that is to make it mandated. Well, nobody likes to be mandated to do stuff, and then everyone's just doing it to do it because they have to, not because they think it's necessary. And in the end, that piece got dropped. It recently got put back on an amendment that is going through now, and then removed from that amendment. But as I told Tony, I think we're going to see it again because there's a lot of contention, not contention, but ambivalence in the community about whether or not that's necessary. And I know for me, what I do instead is I just call law enforcement and say, hey, I had a guy actually a couple weeks ago who had threatened to shoot up his school. He'd been posting all this stuff on Instagram. FBI was involved because it was online. Local law enforcement was involved because it was his high school. They didn't know what to do with him because they didn't really have charges. They brought him to us. And I was like, this guy's, I don't know what I'm going to do for this guy, but okay. So I said, why don't you guys file a gun violence restraining order, and let's at least make sure that if he falls through the cracks of all of our systems, he doesn't have guns. So I think that's the way to do it now for practitioners, but we'll see that again. Yeah?
So when you personally petition for the 21-day order, do you go to court when they're trying to petition for an entire year or during the due process? How often do you get called in to testify?
So this is another really interesting issue that came up with practitioners. Would they be able to subpoena our records, which are private? And there's always issues, at least where I work, about people wanting to subpoena our mental health records for other purposes. So I've never been called in to testify because I've never been, since I can't be the one filing the order. But I have recommended to family members and to police that they do it, and then they're the ones, it's the petitioner who has to go in and testify. Theoretically, they could subpoena mental health records, and depending on where you work, I know where I work, we're very protective of our records, and we don't usually have them even if they're subpoenaed, so. Yeah.
So you talked about TerraSoft notification. Have you ever ran into making a TerraSoft notification of law enforcement and having law enforcement file the paperwork to DOJ for a 5-year ban based on your TerraSoft?
I mean, that's how it's supposed to happen, right? Yeah, okay, so, but it's interesting that you asked that because I feel like people don't necessarily know that about TerraSoft. Okay. In fact, I will admit I didn't know that until I started doing gun violence work. So a TerraSoft warning, for people who don't know, is it's very specific language. If a patient makes a threat to a psychotherapist of physical violence against a reasonably identifiable victim, you are required to do your due diligence to protect the victim. And being the subject of a TerraSoft warning is supposed to subject you to a 5-year prohibition. But I think people don't realize that the duty to protect has to involve calling law enforcement. Otherwise, there's no mechanism for it to get reported to DOJ for them to be prohibited. This also does not apply if you're like an ER doc or a family practice doc or somebody who's not a psychotherapist. But if you are a counselor, an MFT, or a psychiatrist, then you are a psychotherapist, and if somebody reports this to you, you have to notify authorities. It also, one of the kind of cracks that people fall through for TerraSoft is, if you make a bunch of global threats like, I hate this place, I'm just gonna blow it to bits in sky high, that's not a reasonably identifiable victim. So it doesn't qualify. You have to say like, I'm gonna go after Bob. That's the guy I'm getting, and that's the identifiable victim.
One more question.
Yeah, and feel free to make comments too, Eddie, since I know you know lots about this.
One of the things I was looking at is the length of the relationship with the therapist and the client for notification to DOJ. So if somebody, because a lot of times a 5150 hold is written, and somebody sits in an ER, and then the hold expires, and then they don't get to an LPS facility, so then there's no hearing, there's no ban for the welfare institutions. But if you had a licensed therapist who said this person should not have a firearm, is that, how long does the relationship need to be for law enforcement to do the process of filing to DOJ?
You mean in terms of the license, how long does the psychotherapist relationship have to be?
So the DOJ, yes, because the DOJ paperwork is filed by the LPS facility.
Right.
But law enforcement can actually file that too, if a licensed therapist notifies them.
And I think that's with TerraSoft. It can be, I mean, if I meet somebody for 10 minutes in a professional setting and they make a threat to me that I hear, I'm required to report it to law enforcement. I don't think everybody knows that, but it is the case. Whereas with the admission for dangerousness prohibition in California, yeah, the admitting facility does it. But again, we're all standing there thinking about admitting our patients not on the basis of firearm prohibitions, but on the basis of patient care. So I see people all the time that, yeah, I think they're dangerous as all get out, but I don't think they need to be hospitalized, or I don't think they would benefit from being hospitalized. And so I send them out. And those folks, yeah, if there's a TerraSoft in place, the therapist has to call DOJ. We have people at our place who do it for us. Or if a gun violence restraining order needs to be filed, it needs to be filed.
It's like everybody just kind of throws their hands up. And can you speak to that? Like, little kids, they're these beautiful little kids that are suffering, and we have wonderful counselors.
Yeah, and that is I think where it starts for a lot of the school shooters, is it starts early on with social and family and support problems. And I'm always hesitant to point the finger at the mental health system and say, somebody didn't do their job or they didn't get enough of this. I think it's really hard to catch those people in the safety net and pull them out of where they're headed in time. It would be great if we had really good counselors and really good support systems in all elementary and middle and high schools. I think that would be wonderful. I do think that would actually help. But it's too much of a burden to put on people who are also trying to meet, the core curriculum and all that, to also be in charge of the mental health problems of these young kids. And And it's tricky with gun violence restraining orders too, right? Because a middle schooler doesn't own a gun legally. So what are you going to do? And you can't always file them against the parents or the roommate or the brother or whoever it is who does own the gun. So that's where the piece of educating families really is important about keeping lethal means out of their system. When you look at who actually perpetrates school shootings, it's not middle schoolers, but those people were middle schoolers at one time. And it's really different to me. The people I've evaluated mostly have been 17, 18, 19-year-olds that have made me concerned about this. I've seen 9-year-olds who have said, like, I'm going to go shoot at my school. And I'm not that worried about a 9-year-old for the most part. My threshold is going to be a lot higher to do something extreme to intervene because I just don't have the faith that they'd even be able to handle the weapon, let alone get a hold of it and do stuff. But in 5 or 6 years, that kid could be really dangerous. It's hard. Anyone else with comments or questions? Yeah.
Just your thoughts on how we got to this point. I think it's in my lifetime that just term mental illness became accepted by most people, like going to a computer test or something. So it's not that long ago that it became common thought. How did something like that that's so recent all of a sudden become the first go-to for gun violence?
Yeah, it's a good question, and thank you for just assuming that they're not necessarily related. I think it's an easy out for people. I think talking about gun control laws is really hard and touchy, and it is like everyone across the political spectrum can say, "Oh, let's bolster up the mental health system." So it does become it becomes a palatable alternative in a lot of ways. But I do think it detracts from the real problem, and I think it is not going to be, the kind of bolstering we would have to do to make any kind of impact would be not plausible, unfortunately. Yeah.
I just want to thank you as a fellow mental health
Thank you.
professional, that how important what you're doing, clearly changing the law. I commend you on taking the time to do that. And also the education that is so essential to keep
Yeah.
it going. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much, Amy. I want to point out to you that the gun violence restraining order is on this flyer. We have many of them. On your way out, you can read that. Also, the organization people who are working on the gun violence restraining order have created a wonderful website, and you really need to go there and read it and understand it. So if you want to take one of these, it will help you understand the law. Sorry. I want to sort of slightly switch the subject, but not quite. The Coalition Against Gun Violence has been working for the past 4 years to get this information about school safety and locking up your firearms and asking Saves Kids. We have been trying to get this information to the Santa Barbara school districts, and we have failed. Just recently, the Fund for Santa Barbara gave us an emerging grant amount, and we are now going to pursue, along with the Santa Barbara Youth Council, we have a task force, and we are going to pursue getting this information to families in Santa Barbara County that should have gotten there quite some time ago. Jackie and I went in front of the city council and we said, this needs to be done. Would you like to say a few words, Jackie?
First of all of you received a packet when you came in, and the packet looks like this. This is the task force that we're creating here in the city. It's a task force that's created and developed by our local youth and by different folks around the community. Within this packet, you will see all of the different policies that we want to change and that we want to implement within our local jurisdictions, within our schools, and within our police departments. The policies that we're asking for are not an asks, and really they're asks that come from the Department of Homeland Security, from the California Department of Education, and from the Department of Justice. But we're incorporating them into 3 little bubbles that are policies for every specific area. So we have a lot of elected officials here today. I hope you will look at these bubbles and see which one fits you. And I hope that you will listen when your youth council and your youth leaders come to you and ask you to make these policies a reality into the city and into the county. Because this is your youth asking for things. And there are some things in here that were left out because the issue of gun safety is so controversial that we went back and forth on things like, should there be people with firearms on campus? But your youth are taking the leadership. It's up to you to back them up. So, how do you do that? We're going to be passing around these clipboards here, ladies and gentlemen, elected officials in the room. We need to get involved, and we're asking you to do a couple of things. One, to sign up in this clipboard here and check off a box where you will either be a part of the task force, do something very simple like come to our May 1st press conference to talk about the gun buyback, or actively participate in the board, in our committee, with the Coalition Against Gun Violence. This needs to happen, guys. We need to be able to support our youth with aligning with this task force and supporting these small policy changes. And we also need to get involved with this coalition, or it just is never going to get there. So this will be coming around. Please remember that we do have a gun buyback, but we are very honored that the city of Santa Barbara has invested in this, that nobody else in the county had until Carpinteria decided to join forces. And it takes every single one of us asking constantly to be able to make this happen. So thank you guys for your effort.
So this is what I meant about the Coalition Against Gun Violence making a difference in the community. Now is the, before you leave, if you can stay for a few more moments. This is the time for the bell ceremony. Mary Lee and Charlie Black, who started their organization in Orange County at the same time as the coalition did and the Women Against Gun Violence, they have a special relation, and they invented something or created something called the bell ceremony, which we feel is a reminder, continual reminder to honor those whom we have lost. So Mary Lee and Charlie, would you like to come up and begin?
The bell has played a very important role in our history. It rings out when there's victories. It also tolls when there are tragedies. And in this case, our young man was an honors math and physics major. And between his junior and senior year in college, he went back to New York City to enjoy the Big Apple. And every Sunday night, we'd get a great call from him. He was having a fantastic time. He had just finished his junior year. He got the perfect paper in something called partial differential equations, and was invited back to an honors math class his senior year. Only in this case, he was 21 years young, and we got a call at 3 a.m. You don't ever want to get a call at 3 a.m. in the morning, no matter what. And a New York detective told us 4 short sentences. Your son was the victim of a robbery. He did not offer resistance. He was shot. He is deceased. So, in his honor, we put together this particular ceremony. And thanks to Tony and so many other wonderful people, we've been able to perpetuate it. And Mary Lee, would you like to ring the bell in honor of our son Matthew Charles Black?
I ring this bell in the memory of Matthew Black and also for the students of Parkland School. And I invite everyone else who has a loved one that they would like to honor or remember today to come up and start, I guess the way we're situated, let's come this way and then we'll line that way and ring the bell in honor of our loved ones. Thank you.
So please do come up and say their name and toll the bell.
Michael Jason Spradling, he was 25 when he was murdered.
My cousin Brian Carreño, my foster son Paulino Premier.
After 14 years, I hate doing this. My brother, Michael Patrick Musicar, took his own life in 2004, and then 10 years later, his son Matthew did. I really believe, and my family does too, that if Texas had a 10-day waiting period, that there would be two wonderful people in our family probably still alive.
I'm reading this for a friend of mine who lost her sister and brother-in-law, Robert and Shelley Oregon, in the Sutherland Springs in Texas. She just really finds it too difficult yet to come forth.
I would like to ring, toll the bell for the people at the Goleta postal shooting. We should always remember them. I would like to ring the bell for Jamie Guttenberg. She was 14 years old. For Martin Duque Anguiano, he was 14. Coach Aaron Feist, 37. Gina Montalto, 14. Alyssa Alhaldev, 14. Scott Bangle, 35. Nick Dworet, 17. Coach Chris Hickson, 49. Luke Hoyer, 15. Carmen Skenter, 16. Meadow Pollock, 18. Joaquin Walk Oliver, 17. Alana Petty, 14.
Kara Lundgren, 14. Alex Skinner, 14. Peter Wong, 15. And finally, Helena Ramsey, 17.
I would like to ring the bell for all of our law enforcement persons who have committed suicide over the years recently in our community. Miguel Lamarco, PD officer.
My husband, a Korean war veteran, whenever he is here, he wishes to toll the bell for all American servicemen and women who have given their lives in all the different wars of America.
Charlie? Go ahead.
I wanted to toll the bell for the students lost in our Vista 2014.
Thank you for being here. Mary Lee and I, 19 years ago on April 20th, you might not recognize that date, that was the Columbine High School shooting, and we were keynote speakers in Denver, Colorado on the steps of the State House. It's so much different today. Social media, the young people, we feel it. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being involved. In Orange County, we have 4 key congressional races. We're going to kick those dinosaurs out. We're going to replace them with folks that think like we do and that will create bluntly, people who look like me have done a really poor job of protecting these youngsters, and we need to step forward and take credit for doing and helping them now, because by golly, we're a part of a real movement, and I hope you stay sustained. So thank you for being here.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to our 23rd event, and we appreciate your support. Please do pick up one of these flyers, Speak for Safety, because the gun violence restraining order is the law that may make a difference. Well, in California, we have the law, but across the nation, 5 states are right now also having the law. So thank you so much for coming, and I hope you enjoy this beautiful facility. Santa Barbara Club always does a wonderful job.